Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Joe, and for the invitation to speak here. And thank you all for coming tonight. It looks like it's going to be an amazing event. So, yes, I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, perhaps just give you a little taste of the MI5 whistleblowing years so that you can make sense of why I do what I do now in terms of campaigning not only against the war on drugs, but a whole range of other wars, including the war on whistleblowers, the war on terror, the war on the internet, what I call the war on freedoms, really. And then I want to delve a bit more into one of the organisations I've been working with quite extensively over the last 10 years, which is an organisation called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is a global organisation campaigning to end the failed war on drugs. And then look a little bit more into the reasons why we feel passionately that the war on drugs has egregiously failed and we need to put a stop to it before any more global harm can be done. And also give you a little ray of hope at the end that, in fact, things are changing. There are some good steps being made, but also a slightly more cynical view of why I think the war on drugs will indeed end. I've been saying in the next decade for a decade, but I'll say again, in the next decade. So, the MI5 background is a bit of a weird story. I sort of fell into it by accident. I never wanted to be a spy. I quite fancy being a diplomat, swanning around embassy parties, drinking champagne. Although the reality is actually cheap plonking plastic glasses in an office if you're lucky. So I applied to the Foreign Office and had this weird letter from the Ministry of Defence saying there may be other jobs you would find more interesting. Please call this number. And I don't know why, but my very first instinctive response, and please pardon my French, it's very fluent, was, fuck, it's MI5. I don't know why, and I was instinctively frightened. This was way back in 1990, right after the 80s, when MI5 had been involved in all sorts of unsavoury scandals. Unfortunately, I was going to ignore that letter because of my response. My father was with me when I opened the letter and uttered the fateful words. Now, my father loved spy novels, things like John le Carré, and probably more crucially, he was also an investigative journalist. So his response was, please ring up this number, please see if it's MI5. So the rest, as they say, is history, and everything that happened subsequently, I've always been able to blame on my father, which is always a nice position to be in. So I did indeed ring up that number and found myself being recruited over a period of 10 months. And I was told at the time, in 1990, that they were not as they had been portrayed in the media. They had to obey the law. And they wanted a new generation of counter-terrorism officers, not someone who would just investigate political activists or Russians. And every time I got through each stage, and it was very intensive, and then the vetting as well, every time I got through, and I've been entirely honest, because you think they're MI5, they must already know everything about you, they kept inviting me back. So in the end, feeling quite reassured, I thought, this actually could be a good job. It could make a difference, and potentially even save lives. So I signed on the dotted line, I signed the Official Secrets Act, and in January 1991, I walked through the door for the first time. I was there for 6 years, in 3 different postings, and imagine my surprise when the very first posting was political activists, which is what they said they stopped doing at the end of the Cold War. First lie. It was also in that section that I met my man and partner, who became a very notorious whistleblower, a man called David Shaler, who ended up blowing the whistle in the late 1990s. We then had another 2 years in the counter-Irish terrorism section, and we had another 2 years as well in international terrorism. And every section we worked in, we saw things going badly wrong. And every time we raised our concerns, along with many of our colleagues, we were told to just shut up, follow orders, and don't rock the boat. So in 1996, when David was then head of the Libyan section, and he saw a plot unfolding which involved MI6, our foreign James Bond wannabes, funding Al-Qaeda, who was even then a known terrorist enemy, funding Al-Qaeda in Libya to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi, the head of state at the time, illegally, and the attack went wrong and innocent people died. That was the point when we realised we could no longer stay in the intelligence community in the UK that was effectively involved in state-sponsored terrorism. So we resigned. David took documents to prove what he was saying, and we went to the newspapers to go public about our concerns. And these ranged not only from files on political activists to files on government ministers, to IRA bombing campaigns, which MI5 could and should have stopped and didn't because they made mistakes, through to this illegal assassination attempt, illegal telephone taps on prominent journalists, innocent people being put in prison when MI5 withheld the evidence of their innocence. So there's a whole range of things we were very concerned about, and we knew that by going public, we would automatically end up being prosecuted under the draconian terms of the 1989 Official Secrets Act. So we preemptively fled the UK the day before the story appeared in the newspapers. We went on the run literally around Europe for a month, with MI5 and the secret police, the special branch, trying to chase us across Europe. I always think of it as a bit like the wacky races now, thinking back to it. And I was arrested. David's brothers and friends, supporters, activists and journalists were arrested around him. And David himself went to prison twice for exposing the crimes of the spies. First of all, when the British failed to extradite him from Paris in 1998, but he spent 4 months in prison awaiting that result to be let free. And then also after he returned voluntarily to face the music, to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act in 2002. And with no legal defence, he automatically went back to prison. So it's a very high price to pay, having seen the crimes of the spies, for him to be the one going to prison, and for those who had committed the crimes never even to have been investigated. And I think things might have degenerated to a certain extent as well since then, when we've seen evidence that the spies have been involved in things like torture of terrorist suspects, something that we did not get involved in the 1990s. One, because it's unethical, but two, because it creates what's known as blowback. So there's a very high price to pay. I don't want to sound totally negative about the spy community in this country. We only exposed what we felt was in the public interest, because it was going wrong. And if they can lie and not learn from their mistakes, they are doomed to repeat those mistakes again and again. But good people do join, good people do try and make a difference, and they do get good results more often than not. But even so, the level of secrecy in which they operate makes it very difficult for them to be held to account in any way. So, after all that, David and I separated over a decade ago. And you're left sort of washed up as a whistleblower, particularly a whistleblower coming out of the intelligence agencies or central government, the military, or the diplomatic corps. And you sort of think, what now? You become unemployable. And many of us, and I work with many other intelligence whistleblowers around the world to this day, many of us then have to recreate a life. And many of us go into campaigning and public speaking and writing and becoming media commentators on a variety of issues. And it was because of that, way back in 2008, I think it was, I was actually doing a speaking tour about deep politics, as it's called. Other people might call it conspiracy theories, but, you know, hey. I was doing a speaking tour across Canada, and I did this big talk in Victoria on the West Coast. And after the talk, one of the elite members came up to me and said, that was great. Have you ever thought about talking about the war on drugs and its failure? Have you heard about an organisation called LEAP? And I said, no, what's that? And at that time, it was an organisation that was largely based in America, and the acronym stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, the group I mentioned right at the start. And this is an organisation that expanded rapidly. It was only set up in 2002, and even by then it had a global presence. And by the time I stepped down from being the European director of it in 2016, it had over 150 supporters, 1,000 supporters, sorry, in over 120 countries around this planet. And this is an organisation of people who come from all aspects of law enforcement, right from the bobbies on the beat, all forms of police, including an undercover cop, Neil Woods, I think spoke here recently, lovely guy, through to the lawyers, through to judges, to prison governors, to prison warders, parole officers, even the odd intelligence officer, like myself, and including 3 national and international drug czars. So it's the full spectrum of law enforcement from start to finish if you get fed into that system. And all of us, with many decades of experience in many cases behind us, had seen in our professional lives the utter failure of drug prohibition, the utter failure of the war on drugs that's been waged since 1961, and the utter decimation this has caused across the planet. Now, I know there is a lot of awareness of the harm that drugs can do to local communities, the harm that the policing of drugs can do to local communities and to the individual. What I want to do tonight, though, is pull back a bit and look at it from a more global perspective, because it's very easy for we in the West to be very complacent. We are the consumer countries. We don't have to experience the hard end of the violence inherent in the war on drugs. So I want to look at all aspects. So just to go back to basics, the war on drugs effectively began way back, well, in 1912 actually, with the first anti-drug convention, which was re-ratified by the United Nations in 2012. But it really began in 1961 with the first UN treaty. Further treaty signed against psychoactive drugs in 1979, and then drug trafficking treaty in 1988. So it's those three treaties that bind all the signatories, all the countries of this world, into a one-size-fits-all straitjacket of drug prohibition, putting aside whatever might be the cultural habits in one particular country, or the economic needs in another country, or the religious approach to drugs in a different country. These UN treaties have provided a straitjacket around any individual national sovereignty decisions that could be taken in every country of the planet. And this has egregiously failed in so many different regions for so many different reasons. And it's quite frightening because as part of LEAP and one of the board directors, I did attend 4 UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs events in Vienna. Now these are quite an eye-opener for someone who's had ironically, no diplomatic experience in her life, despite wanting to work for the Foreign Office. This is every March, representatives from all the countries around the planet gather in Vienna with all their aides and their helpers and their supporters, and they sit there to ponder what are the developments in the drug war. And they sit there and they slap each other around the shoulders and say, it's a success. We're going to eradicate drugs from the planet. This is our aim by 2012. This is our aim by 2019. We are winning the war on drugs. Which is plainly not the case, as I will go on to explain in greater detail. And then they spend every day poring over draft resolutions, not about the content of those resolutions, not about how they can make a direct impact on improving the quality of people's lives, but usually the very essence of civil service work, which is, should we put a comma here? Let's take a vote on it. How about changing but to however? Let's take a vote on it. And the crazy thing about the UN is it's not majority vote. It has to be consensus vote. So every delegate has to vote for a change in the comma. And this is how they spend their days, along with lunchtime freebie parties where they all get drunk, evening parties, all free, where they all get drunk. So for one long week in Vienna, it is party time, all on expenses. And this is how drug prohibition is overseen and managed and policy is decided, which affects all of us around the planet. I have to say, the first time I went there, I came back numbed, depressed, and horrified that this is the standard of international policy making and diplomacy. And if countries decide not to adhere to the terms of drug treaties, they are punished by internal bodies within the UN. They can have their funding withdrawn. They can be excoriated by the UN and given a punishment beating, I think is the best way of putting it. Until recently, until the last decade, certain countries have begun to really push back. And interestingly, it was Bolivia, under their rather radical president, Evo Morales, who in 2012 was pushing to have an exemption made under the draconian terms of the UN treaties. And he said, culturally and historically, his people had always been allowed to chew the coca leaf. And understandably, at the altitude of Bolivia, that would make sense, right? But under the terms of all these treaties, his people could no longer pursue their cultural and historic heritage. And he was told repeatedly, you can't change that. You've got to abide by these treaties. So he came back in 2012 and he gave this rousing speech and he said, I'm withdrawing from the UN treaties, unilaterally. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it, and I'll go home and do the same. And I remember it there. He was actually standing in front of all the serried and gathered delegates from around the world, and he took out a pouch of cocoa leaves and started chewing them. So the UN had a bit of a panic about that, saying, how can we manage this? What can we do? But or however. And when he came back the next year, all the other delegates had decided, okay, we'll make an exception in Bolivia's case. So these treaties are not immutable. They're not graven on stone tablets. And Bolivia said, if you make this exception, we'll reaccede to the treaties. So that's what happened. So it just shows that if you actually take a stand, things can change. And I think we've seen that most notably as well with other countries trying decriminalisation programs, of which I'll get onto later, where they have pushed the envelope and got away with it. And we're seeing the results, which are all positive, working for those countries too. So the key question, I should have got this out earlier. The key question is if we are serious about trying to end the war on drugs. From everything I've seen, the fountainhead of this drug prohibition failure comes from the UN. And they are as inert and monolithic a bureaucracy as any you will ever find anywhere on the planet. However, LEAP has been there and been agitating for a number of years now. And we produced a proposed amendment of the United Nations drug treaties, which you can find on the LEAP website. It's leap.cc. We keep it out of the .com realm because the Americans can take it down at will if they want to. And it's worth a read, because this was written by one of our board members, a lawyer, and he's rewritten the treaties, renamed them, and made it very easy for them to segue into what would be a more humane global approach. And in fact, when I was attending in 2014, and the president of the CND stood up at the opening plenary session, and he made a speech, and he'd obviously read this, and basically his speech was just refuting the opening key points of this booklet. It was quite amazing to watch. So we had them worried. So what has been the outcome? Why am I so anti the war on drugs? I keep saying this, it's a failure. Why? Well, we know this from all the statistics. It's been waged for over 50, almost 60 years now. And in that time, we have seen drug use increase exponentially around the planet. We've seen the strength of drugs increase. We've seen the price of drugs on the streets plummet. These are hardly metrics of success, and that's just in the consumer countries, of which, of course, Europe and the UK and the USA are the biggest on the planet. We've seen that millions of people who are just using, they choose to use, they're not even problematic users, of which I think 15% of people who do use develop health issues. We've seen millions of these people being incarcerated for no other reason than they choose to ingest a certain chemical rather than a chemical like alcohol or nicotine. In fact, in the USA, I think I would safely say the USA is the fountainhead of all the bad treaties that the UN has ratified over the years. In the USA, things have been incredibly bad in terms of incarceration of users. And this has been led by big business as well, particularly because a lot of the USA prisons are privatized. And they are given a contract by a state, and under the terms of that contract, they demand that they will have 95% occupancy of the prison in order to make a profit from the prisoners. And the state guarantees this contractually. And then the low-hanging fruit, of course, to put in those prisons are people who might be lifted for smoking a joint or popping an E or something like that. And until recently, some states had a most iniquitous law where if you were arrested 3 times, even for those low-level crimes, you would be 3 strikes and you're out, and you would be sentenced to life without parole in prison. How frightening is that? And in other ways, it's very good for business, particularly in America. Again, they have laws such as asset forfeiture, where local police and state police and federal police, if they suspect you might have had a joint in your car, if you might have had some drugs in your car, or you might have a bundle of money in your car which might come from drug sales, but they can't prove it, but why have you got a bundle of money in your car? Then they could seize your assets. And those seizures are very, if ever, returned, very rarely, if ever, returned. And then you will go to prison as well. And that money is then used by the police to keep their stations open, to buy their kit. I mean, it's like a gangster racket, in a way, the way that the police have gone about policing drugs in America. So America has been the leading fountainhead of all these drug treaties in the UN. They are the leading bullies in the UN to stop reform. And yet, of course, the irony being that America now is leading the way in legalizing the marijuana laws across vast numbers of states, both medicinal and even, shock horror, purely for pleasure. You are allowed now to smoke a joint or eat a cannabis cookie or something. So the hypocrisy of America as well, in still retaining the push to retain the treaties at the UN, while liberalising across much of their country, is simply astonishing. So the impact of this war has been appalling. But I think primarily the impact of this war has hit both consumer countries, such as America, with the incarceration and asset forfeiture and the shredding of their civil liberties to prosecute the war on drugs against their citizens. But of course, there are other brackets of countries too. Most notably, we have the producer countries, and most notably, of course, many of them have been in Latin America historically and remain so to this day, particularly with cocaine. And, of course, in the Middle East and Central Asia, with heroin production particularly. And they have suffered massively in this war on drugs, where whole police forces, countries like Colombia, civil war has been waged, where the police have been entirely militarized, trained up in torture techniques by the CIA, where citizens have been disappeared and tortured, and whole countries can be subverted, and governments can be subverted, because the amount of money made by these producer gangs outstrips the GDP of most small countries. They can buy and sell most small countries. They can certainly buy and sell most of the politicians in these small countries. The havoc, the millions who have died, the millions who have been tortured across the producer states is just astonishing. And most of us, blithely popping a pill at the weekend in our country would have no idea of the sheer scale of the suffering that's gone on. But it gets murkier still, because it's well known that the CIA has used drug money to fund black operations over the last few decades. And even now, there have been recent reports that in Afghanistan, one of the key producers of heroin in Afghanistan, ever since they were gratefully invaded by the democratic forces of NATO back in 2002, which led to absolute carnage in that country. Ever since then, and despite the continued presence of Western armies, NATO armies, the production of heroin has tripled. And we have a situation now where money has been paid by the CIA and by MI6 to notionally to the government to try and eradicate the drug trade. But this money gets parcelled out to the drug warlords. So effectively what we have is the MI6 and the CIA funding the very producer groups within Afghanistan that produces 90% of the world's heroin, which gets shipped to Europe and then gets shipped to the USA. And then, of course, we have a situation where there's the war on drugs to be fought. So it's been carnage for all of the producer regions. We also need to look as well at the transit regions. People tend to forget about these countries. How do the drugs get from Colombia, say, into Europe? How does heroin get from Afghanistan into Europe? And there are well-known channels that are used, transit countries. And again, the carnage has been grotesque. Often law enforcement will find out about certain channels and shut them down, so it's an ever-moving feast as well. And what has happened, particularly over the last decade, has been that the Latin American drug trade has shifted through Western Africa increasingly into Europe. So some of these countries are very fragile and didn't really have very strong law enforcement to begin with, but now they have become failed narco states. Places like Guinea-Bissau and Mali were vulnerable to begin with. They had no chance against the violence and the money of these drug cartels. But also we find as well, after the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, successfully this time in 2011, when MI6 and the CIA were funding the very same groups who tried to off him in 1996, that country, of course, has descended into utter chaos as well, with rival militias and rival Islamist groups fighting it out for more territory. And how are they funding this? Largely because Libya has now become largely a narco state. It is one of the key transit points for these criminal cartels. So it's not just poor migrants who are being shipped across the Med. And because of this as well, we are allowing the drug trade to fund Al-Qaeda and ISIS based in Libya. And also because of this increased drug through flow, Libya, which used to have a very low rate of drug dependency, has suddenly seen an explosion of heroin use amongst its population. And because of that as well, an increase in HIV and AIDS infections. So that country has been ravaged not just by the NATO intervention and the war on terror, but also by the war on drugs too. So I was going to mention the overlap mainly between terrorism and the war on drugs. And this is from personal experience when I was working in MI5, when I sort of first saw the first effects of it. So one of the sections I worked in back in 1993 to 1995 was a branch called T Branch. And this branch was there to investigate all flavours of Irish terrorism. But of course, the vast focus of that was against the provisional IRA at that time, because it was the biggest group and it was running rings around the security agencies and pretty much letting off bombs at will across the UK as well as across Northern Ireland. My job in that section was T5E2. That was my James Bond number. Not so good as 007, but, you know, it'll do. My job was actually to investigate Irish terrorist logistics, which means the infiltration and exfiltration into the UK mainland of people and also of weapons and explosives. So this, of course, brought me massively into contact with the customs at the time, particularly their investigation division, which was tasked with trying to do proper intelligence-led investigations into drug runners, the crime organisations that were bringing drugs particularly into the UK, because the methodology, of course, is very, very similar. So I worked with them on operations at ports and airports and airfields across the country, and I got to know them very well, not only the investigation division based in London, but also the guys on the ground at the ports. And it became very apparent, even then, that they felt they were looking for needles in haystacks. They felt that they were facing an insuperable odds in trying to stop drugs coming into an island, and that they were losing the war on drugs. It didn't stop them trying to do their jobs, of course, because that's what they were legally mandated to do. But there was a feeling of, well, you know, we can stop some of it, but we're not going to stop the vast majority of it. And also, looking at it from my perspective, the overlap of methodology between how terrorist groups were moving things in and out of our country and how the customs were trying to track drugs, the overlap between these two groups was often quite intensely tight, particularly in the case of loyalist terrorists in Northern Ireland, because they received a lot of their income from organised crime, not just the drug trade, but also people trafficking, prostitution, that sort of thing. And it became very clear that they were earning a lot of money from this and using the methodologies they were using for all these other crimes to get people into Northern Ireland and around Europe as well in order to buy weapons and materiel for their attacks. The provisional IRA always said very clearly they didn't deal in drugs, and they would kneecap anyone who did and police their estates and say they wouldn't get involved. But there were certain reports that certain people on the fringes did get involved in that sort of thing. And I'm sure in the sense of wanting to make a bit of money to fund an operation, that wouldn't have been unbelievable. But that was quite low-key in a way, but seeing it up front and personal and working with the guys and women on the ground, trying to combat this needle in a haystack was incredibly difficult and incredibly depressing in a way. But it wasn't just there. I mean, that was quite a small-scale operation in comparison to other countries and in more modern times. So I said that in Afghanistan, the yield has tripled over the last few years. The trade is now worth, they estimate, between $500 million and $1 billion per year. And most of that is going into the pockets of Al-Qaeda affiliates in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We also have a case as well, I mentioned the civil war effectively in Colombia, where we have a situation that, although there is a sort of fragile peace treaty between the left-wing terrorist group FARC and the Colombian government, they were largely funding themselves as well through the drug trade. And that was worth, at the time the ceasefire was signed, worth about $300 million per year. So this is huge, huge money. The UN estimates conservatively that the drug trade globally is worth between $320 billion and $500 billion per year. All of it going into the hands of organised crime, all of it going into the hands of corrupt officials, and all of it going into the hands of terrorist groups around the world. In fact, the DEA in America estimated that over half the currently designated terrorist organisations on this planet were funded largely by the proceeds from the war on from the underground trade in drugs. Now that is a crazy, crazy situation if you think about it, because on the one hand we have the war on drugs, making this trade illegal, driving it underground, producing vast profits that go into the hands of our terrorist enemies. And then on the other hand, and then all the militarized police will go and investigate it. And then on the other hand, we're trying to fight the so-called war on terror, with all our military going to try and fight it. So it's like a sort of sick business cycle that seems to benefit what people usually call the military-industrial security complex, and puts money in the pockets of a lot of very unsavory people and causes vast damage both to our communities and our countries and our national security. But it's doing bugger all for the rest of us, apart from making our lives more dangerous. So, is there any light at the end of this tunnel? Well, one, it would be nice to see some banksters prosecuted over this, a bit more than just in Iceland. This is one of the lesser-known problems as well around the war on drugs, the illegal drug trade, that bank after bank has been caught out money laundering to the vast degrees. In fact, I think one of the most recent was HSBC, which got fined £1.2 billion for money laundering Mexican drug money. There was a quote as well, I think it came out in 2009, from the head of UNODC, the UN Drugs Commission, who was a man at the time called Antonio Maria Costa. And he went on the record publicly and said, in his view, after the financial crash of 2008, most major banks across the planet only had certain liquidity left after this crash because of grey and illegal drug money. Now think about the shock. I mean, this is a senior UN official making this accusation officially, and still very few people were held to account for indulging in this. I think that's absolutely shocking, and I will use the word banksters very carefully. But yes, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. There are more and more countries trying to find wriggle room within the tight boundary, the straitjacket of the UN treaties. And we've seen many different countries trying out different experiments to at least reduce the harm for those who choose to use. Most notably, of course, it started in Netherlands, back in the 1970s, where they decriminalised the use of cannabis. And even to this day, actually it's still very uncool amongst a lot of Dutch youth. They don't touch it. They think it's a bit naff and the sort of thing that the UK and the US people do. So even to this day, they have about half the drug usage, cannabis usage, that you would see per capita compared to the US and the UK. Then, of course, we had in 1994 the Swiss approach, and this was a democratic decision that was taken in one of their famous referenda, where they got a bit annoyed because all these bloody heroin addicts were shooting up and leaving their needles on their very neat streets. And the Swiss like their neat streets. So they held a referendum about the idea of allowing legalised use in safe facilities. And it took people off the streets. It allowed them access to safe doses of heroin. It got rid of all the needles, so it cleaned up the cities. And nobody apparently, I think, I'm aware, has died of an overdose when using heroin in one of these facilities. And they've had referendum after referendum ever since to check that the people are still happy with this solution. And they are. In fact, every time they have a referendum, the vote goes up in support of these safe facilities. So this has been an overwhelming success for the Swiss. And it's a model that has been rolled out in many other countries around the planet now. We've seen safe injection facilities in Canada, in France, in Spain, in Germany, Norway, Australia, Luxembourg even. And all the metrics are looking positive. Also, of course, most famously, Portugal decriminalised personal use of all drugs back in 2000. And since 2001, despite the apocalyptic cries of certain very conservative groups that they become a drug tourist centre and crime would go up and people would die, all the metrics, again, have been utterly positive. Drug use amongst the 15 to 24-year-old age range has fallen drastically. I think it's halved. Crime has gone down. HIV and hepatitis infections have halved. There's been no drug tourism. And there's been a chance of diverting the funds the police would otherwise have used to arrest users to rehabilitation and to harm reduction. So again, it's all been positive. And we're seeing this approach informing the discourse from countries like the Netherlands, from Switzerland, from Portugal, to spread across other countries into Latin America. It's been one of the guiding arguments as well in the very heated marijuana debate in America, which has seen state after state legalize for medicinal use and state after state allow them to smoke for a bit of fun as well. I mean, concept of sin and morality. So there are good signs stirring. Even the UK now, of course, famously is allowing medical experimentation for medical use of MDMA for PTSD sufferers coming out of the military, for psilocybin to treat depression, and of course medicinal cannabis as well for certain medical issues. But even so, it's very little and it's very late. The UK has been an absolute dinosaur in its drug policy reform approach. And I don't know if it's because all the politicians are frightened of the Daily Mail. I don't know if it's because they're guilty about the fact they all made pigs of themselves back in the 1980s at university, but something weird has been going on. However, following this subject for many years and being an avid consumer of all things media, I do hold my hand up to say I do read the Daily Mail online. And whenever there's an article about the drug issue, I always read the comments below the line. I always expect frothing, colonels from the home counties saying, string them up. It's all changed over the last few years. Virtually everyone below the line is now saying, oh, come on, this is a load of rubbish. Let's legalise, let's regulate, and let's tax, because it would be good for our country, it would be good for our economy, it would be good for our kids and our communities. Now, this is the Daily Mail readership. I don't want to insult anyone who is a genuine fan. I leave that to my conversations with my mother, who still doesn't believe I've worked for Lieb. But things are shifting culturally as well. And I think that gives us hope. If even this debate can now be held without absolute fear within the UK, I think we need to push forward. In fact, there was a very famous report that was written by a drug policy reform organisation called Release a few years ago. And they did an investigation into what the financial benefit might be to the UK if only cannabis out of all the drugs was legalised in the near future. And their view was very, very clear that it would produce 1.6 billion added revenue per year to the UK economy. And this came mainly from tax. If it was regulated and taxed, it would be about 1.2 billion going into the Treasury. But the savings from the justice system would be vast as well. I think it was 170 million coming from the policing, 155 million from the criminal justice system, the courts, and 135 million from the prison services. And this report came out a few years ago, so I'm sure it would be, the figures would be even higher now. And in this very precarious, Brexity type potential financial meltdown era, it might be worth, just from a financial point of view, as well as a humanitarian point of view and sane point of view, to really open up and force this debate about full legalisation, regulation and taxation. I think as a mature, supposedly, democracy, how can we avoid this discussion anymore? And the other point I would make as well, pulling into the more UK perspective, is the adverse impact that this war on drugs has had on our communities and our policing, particularly, where the law has been effectively made to be seen to be an ass, where people, and I don't know anyone of my generation, and this is an old generation now, who hasn't experimented with drugs at some point. And I'm sure it's the same for generations afterwards. So people take drugs, people enjoy drugs. Most people don't develop a problem with drugs. And why on earth should they be criminalised for that process? So, therefore, if they are arrested, if they are prosecuted, they think, well, I haven't done anything wrong, I'm not harming anyone, it's, my choice, my body. And yet, this leads to a breakdown of trust between the police and the policed, which should be a social contract. I mean, we were the very first country around the world who had a formal police service. It was set up by Sir Robert Peel in the 1830s. And his principles were very clear, that the police were part of their local communities. They were there to serve their local communities. They were there to protect their local communities against violent criminals. They were not there to police the morals of those local communities or to breach the trust within their communities as well. And if a law is seen to be completely out of date, out of step with societal norms, that law needs to be revisited and needs to be changed. And I would scale that up to the UN too, where the treaties from 61 and 71 are so woefully out of date and so irrelevant to the global experience of drug use that they should be consigned to history. I mean, you get people like Peter Hitchens, for example, who I've got a lot of respect for as a human being. He's a nice guy who will argue about the evilitude of drugs and the moral problem with drugs. And he talks about these UN treaties and drug laws as if they are something handed down from the hand of God and graven on stone tablets and passed to us, as if laws once set in place can never be reformed. But if we took that approach, we would still be burning witches. We would be imprisoning homosexuals. We would not have women allowed to vote or stand as MPs, and all sorts of other things. Society moves on, technology moves on, social norms change, and our society's laws should be open to real debate and be open to real reform if necessary, to reflect a modern society. I mean, those treaties were put in place, 61, 71 mainly, and this was pre-AIDS, pre-HIV. This was pre-legal highs, or what used to be called legal highs, which are evil and dangerous, much more so than the organic drugs, as some of us were discussing earlier. So these laws are completely out of step with the modern reality of use, with modern scientific research, and with modern health issues. And that's another reason for trying to reform the drug laws, both at a national level and also at the international level, the UN level. If those drug treaties were repealed, and if nation-states were allowed to make their own laws to reflect their own customs, religious practices, social norms, rather than imposing this straitjacket that's caused so many problems at so many levels globally, then sure, there will be still some countries where you might get beheaded if you take drugs, like some of the countries in the Middle East, where you might be imprisoned and given hard labour for a number of years, like you still get in Russia, because that is their culture, and that would be potentially their choice. I'm not agreeing with it, but each country should be able to reflect its societal norms. And I think our countries would become much more liberal and much safer, and would not only save a lot of money, but potentially make a lot of money, save a lot of lives, and save our communities and our future children as well. So this is why, over the last few years, I've been very happy and very proud to work with LEAP. I've had the chance to go to the UN, still mentally scarred, as you can obviously tell. I've had the chance to meet drug czars across Europe, to give evidence in parliaments. I even ended up going to Downing Street once by accident. I didn't mean to go there. So it's been a sort of roller coaster ride, and seeing all those things and working with so many amazing people across North America and Europe, seeing the response of parents who've lost their kids to drugs, who now go out and campaign to reform the drug laws to protect and make safer the drugs their kids can ingest. There's a wonderful campaign called Anyone's Child that works with LEAP UK. I recommend anyone to have a look at that. All these things argue for absolute fundamental reform from the top down. And that's what LEAP tries to engage in, and that's what LEAP tries to do. So I think I've probably waffled on enough about a whole range of different things. So I suggest a sort of quick 10-minute break. Anyone who likes cigarettes, legal drug, or vaping, legal drug, I'll be outside for those 10 minutes. After that, I'll be back and happy to answer or attempt to answer any questions you can throw at me. And thank you very much for your attention.